wait a few minutes, or not a few minutes, we'll wait a minute or two for folks to come in. We're expecting a large crowd here, so it will take about a minute for all the folks to come in. Welcome, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. I'm honored to introduce tonight's program on behalf of our museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. Tonight, we are welcoming Deborah Caldwell-Stone and Bridget Quinn for a discussion about fighting book banning and censorship in our libraries. I'll be introducing our guest and moderator, or both of our guests, more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you as the audience can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guests' discussion tonight. And we encourage you to do so. And if you have any specific question for guests, you can go ahead and post that directly into our Q&A section, and they will hopefully answer your question. So chat in the chat and questions in the Q&A. Please note that you can also click on live transcript to see live auto captioning for this event. That's all. Now that I've said all I wanted to say in terms of housekeeping, I will formally introduce our guests for tonight. Deborah Caldwell-Stone is director of ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom and executive director of the Freedom to Read Foundation. For over 20 years, she has worked closely with library professionals and library trustees on a wide range of intellectual freedom issues related to library service in the United States. She has served on the faculty of the ALA-sponsored Lawyers for Libraries and Law for Librarians workshops and is a contributor to the 10th edition of the Intellectual Freedom Manual. She has contributed articles on law, policy, and intellectual freedom to American libraries and other publications. Bridget Quinn is the CEO of the Hartford Public Library, which is where I work and where I grew up as well, because I grew up in Hartford, and serves as the secretary of the Mark Twain House and Museum's Board of Trustees. She began her career as a children's librarian at Middle Country Public Library on Long Island. She was then an interlibrary loan coordinator with the Connecticut State Library in Middletown for 2 years, director of Essex Library Association in Connecticut for 9 years, director of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library System in New York for 3 years. And first, she was the executive vice president and chief operating officer, and then interim president and CEO of Queens Library before she came to HPL. So that is all from me. So please sit back and enjoy. And don't forget that there will be a Q&A, maybe at the end, maybe a little bit before the end, maybe closer to the middle. So make sure to post your questions at any time. Bridget and Deborah, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Omar. I am thrilled to be here with Deborah. As a librarian, the American Library Association's Office of Intellectual Freedom is a resource that we are so thankful exists. And it's one of those things that we're so happy to know it exists, but we hope we never need it, right? But the sad thing is right now, so many libraries need this. And I think it might be helpful for the people tuning in to have a sense, Deborah, of what the Office of Intellectual Freedom and the Freedom to Read Foundation, what you do and what your role is in ALA and to support libraries and intellectual freedom across the country.
Certainly. You should understand first that the Office for Intellectual Freedom is part of the American Library Association. We're a member service unit, and we've been in existence since 1969. Our charge is very broad. It says we're to have a comprehensive program to promote intellectual freedom in libraries and for library users across the country, and to support librarians in the ability to meet the information needs of their communities. And that has taken many forms. One is that we do public outreach programs, and BAM Books Week, in fact, is one of our public outreach programs that we do on an annual basis. We also spotlight the most challenged books during National Library Week, and we promote other activities throughout the year that support intellectual freedom, support privacy, and generally just support individuals' ability to use and access the library with complete freedom. We also do continuing professional education for librarians such as yourself. We assist our member leaders in developing practices and policies for libraries to use. We assist member groups, like, for example, we work closely with the Connecticut Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Committee. And then I do things like this. I speak, I've taught webinars, I've written chapters for intellectual freedom textbooks or librarianship textbooks, and generally supporting librarians in their work of promoting intellectual freedom and in addition, the privacy of library users, which is always very important. And I was always felt very privileged to have assisted the Connecticut 4 when they were challenging the Patriot Act. Oh, it's been more than a decade now, hasn't it?
Yes.
But it's all been part of our work. The Freedom to Read Foundation has a distinct mission as a separate 501c3 organization. We actually engage in litigation in defense of the freedom to read, particularly for library users. And it's comparable to what OIF does, but we look for opportunities to go to court to both defend the library users' right to read and the ability of library workers to provide information to their communities. We also support the broader First Amendment mission, so we will join or support litigation that's defending First Amendment freedoms like the freedom of the press, the freedom to participate in protests. We've also looked at privacy litigation and where we saw a connection between preserving privacy and preserving the freedom to read, we joined that litigation. An important but smaller part of the Freedom to Read Foundation is our grants program. We provide grants directly to libraries and school systems that want to observe BAM Books Week, but don't have the financial resources to do so. So about every year we provide 10 to 12 grants to library systems and schools across the country so they can celebrate the freedom to read themselves in their local communities. And the second thing we do is we promote intellectual freedom education for students in library science schools, and we provide scholarships, we provide textbook scholarships, and generally assist coursework that's being offered to librarians. So you can see we have a very, very broad mission. We do many things, but one of the things I like to say we are most important things we do, both between FTRF and OIF, is our individual challenge support. Any library worker, any teacher, any community member can call our office and ask for assistance with fighting censorship in their community. So if a librarian calls us, we work with them to make sure that they have policies in place, make sure that they have talking points and strategies to address censorship, that generally they have the tools they need to conduct a reconsideration policy review and successfully defend both the policy and the ability of library users to read books in their community. We'll do the same for educators, and we've worked with community members as well. We also work with library trustees on that. In fact, I'd have to say that that's one of the most essential things we do is our one-on-one assistance to librarians, library workers.
And I think, that when I was, all joking aside, when I mentioned in the intro that we hope we never need to use that, but it is such a valuable resource, because when those challenges come, even you can be as well prepared as you can possibly be with your policies and procedures and reconsideration request process, but it's still very jarring to face that kind of experience, and knowing that there's a resource for librarians and trustees and schools and parents and individuals to access is incredibly valuable. Just a few days ago, the ALA, the Office of Intellectual Freedom, released a report about the 2021 status and data that you've collected about challenged materials, and it's pretty distressing from a intellectual freedom to read perspective, as far as noting a trend, a really strong trend, an uptick in the number of challenges that schools and libraries are receiving for the materials that they provide. Could you give an overview of what your report shared with us over these last year?
Absolutely. One of the things we do as part of our support for Banned Books Week, part of our support for the profession as a whole, is we gather data from library workers in the field, educators in the field, about book censorship that's going on in their institutions. And we hear a lot because we promise confidentiality. You know that sometimes that's very important in these situations. And then we monitor media reports. We monitor local media, we monitor regional media to discover what's going on at board meetings and in communities across the country. And that's how we develop our most challenged book lists and keep track of what we're seeing. And this year and last year, we just saw an incredible increase in the number and volume of challenges reported to our office. I've been with the Office for Intellectual Freedom since the year 2000, so 22 years now. I've never seen a time when we were getting anywhere from 5 to 10 challenge reports in a single day. And that's what we're seeing right now. It used to be we get 2 or 3 reports in a week, and now we're seeing 20, 30, 40 a week, depending on the time of the year. We see a sharp uptick at the beginning of the school year, of course, but sometimes we'll see social media drive a number of challenges. Someone posts something to social media about a book, and all of a sudden libraries in different communities across the country reporting that they're getting challenges to that title as well. So this year, last year we had 729 challenges reported to the office over the course of the calendar year. And those challenges were challenges to 1,597 books. And if you wanted to put that in context, in 2019, which was the last year before the pandemic, when schools and libraries were fully open, we received roughly 344 challenges to some 525 titles. So you can see that last year we had an enormous increase. And I have to tell you that that increase hit us all at once at the beginning of the school year. So the vast majority of those challenges were reported to us between September and December 31st. This year, in the 9 months since January 1st, we've received 681 reports of challenges to some 1,600 titles. So we're not only on track to match last year's numbers, we're on track to exceed them. And, 681 challenges is just an enormous number. And we know we don't hear about every challenge. There is a chilling effect. We know that library workers and librarians still can lose their jobs over their defense of intellectual freedom. One of the reasons we do promise confidentiality. And sometimes we just don't hear about it. And we know from looking at material that's developed by journalists through FOIA reports and researchers through public records requests that we know that we're not hearing about every challenge. So we're at the tip of the iceberg. We're showing the trends and what we're seeing. And we can really trace this to these organized groups going to school boards and library boards and demanding the censorship of whole lists of books. I have to say that what we're seeing is a real phenomenon right now, and this is reflected in the data we're collecting this year, that challenges are no longer one-on-one. It used to be a parent would see their child reading a book, or they'd see a book on display in the library, they'd pick it up and look at it, and they'd see something to concern them. And they'd take it to the librarian, they'd take it to the teacher and have a conversation. It was very one-on-one. A challenge would come in to a title. Now we're seeing persons go to board meetings with a long list of titles, and it's clear that they haven't read them. They're challenging them because they're seeing bad book lists on websites of advocacy groups like Moms for Liberty or Parents Defending Education, similar groups like that across the country, or they're looking on social media. We actually have a case right now that we're working on in Idaho where an advocacy group in their community came to the board and said, we want you to take these obscene books off the shelf. There was a list of 400 titles. And as it turned out, not a single one of the books on that list was in the library's collection. But still, they're pressing the library to vow to censor the books should they ever come across the desk of the librarian in that community. And because the library stood up, the library trustees stood up and said, we're not going to say we're going to censor something in advance. We don't know what the information needs are in our community. We might need to buy that book. The library is going through a lot of struggles right now in its community. And we're seeing similar things occur across the country. Challenges to books that aren't in the collection, challenges to books individuals aren't reading. So it's a very agenda-driven set of challenges. It's a very political set of challenges that's targeting a very limited number of genres and topics in libraries.
Are you, is there an arc to the trend of the kinds of materials that are being challenged?
Absolutely. What we're finding is that the challenges these days, particularly those arising from representatives of advocacy groups, are targeting books that represent the lives and experiences of individuals and groups that have been traditionally marginalized in our society, particularly LGBTQIA persons. And with the recent campaign that was targeting works by Black authors and works about the Black perspective on our history of racism under that thing called critical race theory, which we know isn't really critical race theory, but it's the tag that some partisan advocates have put on it. We're seeing books about racism, the history, U.S. history with racism and slavery in the United States be targeted for removal. And in fact, we're seeing legislation introduced by elected officials to bar the consideration of those topics in schools across the country. And so we have a number of states that have successfully adopted those laws. We can call them educational gag orders, but targeting books dealing with race, racism, sexism, under this broad rubric of divisive topics. And it's really having a chilling effect on the books available in classrooms and the books available in school libraries addressing those topics. And now we're seeing the Don't Say Gay laws passed. Florida has led the way, but we're now getting reports from school librarians in the state of Florida that they've been required to clear out every single book in their classroom libraries because the school administrators are fearful of getting challenged in court or by the State Board of Education about the content of the books on the shelf. And so in that case, we're seeing the available books, the education available to the young people in those states narrowed to topics or a discussion that only allows for one perspective, for one idea. And we know that this is incredibly damaging to young people in their education.
So are you seeing libraries and schools? I mean, you just mentioned one instance where schools are changing their operation in light of this so that they don't have to face these challenges. Are libraries across the country, do you see them changing their collection development policies? How are they responding? And there's actually one question in the chat that I think was sort of pertinent to this, is that there obviously must be times when library staff and their boards are not aligned on these. So how are you finding through your office that you're able to help navigate some of these really challenging discussions between boards and librarians, as well as a profession that's really trying to navigate this in a responsible way?
Well, I'm pleased to report that many library boards, public library boards in particular, are standing up and saying we are adhering to constitutional principles. We're going to protect the First Amendment. We're going to protect the 14th Amendment rights against discrimination. We're going to defend the freedom to read and adhere to the Code of Ethics, the ALA Code of Ethics and the Library Bill of Rights. And recently in Wellington, Colorado, the library board, in the face of many challenges, issued a definitive statement that they would not be removing any books on the shelf based on reasons related to, we don't like gay people, we don't like critical race theory, we want all those books off the shelf. And a good number of library boards have resisted the call to censor books because they don't fit someone's moral or political agenda. Where we've seen issues is where elected officials have appointed board members who do have a pro-censorship agenda. What we're aware of is the situation in Llano County, Texas, for example. A political advocacy group wanted the removal of a long list of books. The board resisted. And so the mayor fired them and replaced them with the actual persons who are demanding censorship of books. And they've been running the library ever since. And so they removed the library from the ebook platform. So all of a sudden, elderly people and disabled people in their community no longer had access to electronic resources because they didn't like a few books in the ebook collection. They removed a vast swath of books from the library and its branches. When one branch librarian stood up and said, no, I'm not going to take these books out of my library, there's nothing wrong with them, they actually terminated her employment. And when that happens, we offer very targeted assistance. There's something called the Leroy C. Merritt Humanitarian Fund that's operated through the ALA. It is a separate charitable trust, but it provides financial assistance to librarians who are facing employment difficulties because of their defense of intellectual freedom or because they're experiencing discrimination because of their race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or sex. So, we do our best. We do provide one-on-one counseling. We will make referrals. We will work with cooperating organizations to get assistance to librarians who are facing these challenges. We all need to be very aware of who is standing for office, who is being appointed to our boards, because they are the governing bodies and they make the decisions about the policies and the procedures that govern library service in the community. And they will often end up being the final decision makers when someone asks for a book to be censored from the library shelves. And so we have also created another tool, and this is a tool for communities. It's not a tool for members of ALA or members of the profession. It's intended for members of the public to use. It's called Unite Against Book Bans. It's at uniteagainstbookbans.org, and it's a platform for individuals to use to organize, to oppose censorship in their communities. And there are things to use like candidate questionnaires, a means of checking on your voter registration, how to write a letter to the editor, how to reach out to your neighbors, your relatives, your networks in your community, and organize them. We have to, one of the things that many people don't realize is we don't have a federated library system in the United States. It's all local, as you well know. And so we have to be engaged with our local boards, our local school boards, our local library boards. We find out when individuals stand up at the board meetings in defense of the freedom to read, to say that they don't want censorship in their community. Often efforts to censor books don't fail. It's when these individuals are a very vocal and loud minority that's unopposed in board meetings that often their attempts to censor books succeed.
Yeah. So one of the questions in the chat, I mean, you mentioned an active lawsuit that's going on in Idaho, but there's another question in the chat. It says, why aren't we hearing more of First Amendment suits being filed in response to book bans? But there may be more we just haven't heard of. Are there other active litigation efforts out there to push back against censorship of reading materials?
Well, in fact, it was actually Llano County, Texas. That's where a lawsuit has been filed by the patrons of the public library to push back against what's being done there in the community, the dismantling of the library, being unresponsive to a large part of the community that doesn't want censorship in their library. And that lawsuit is progressing, but litigation is slow. It goes through a process. They're still in the initial stages. There'll need to be a trial, the presentation of evidence. It's one of the worst ways to vindicate rights, but if we have to use it, we'll use it. A second lawsuit is in Missouri, where the ACLU is challenging the removal of books from a high school library, which is under slightly different standards. But again, it's a lawsuit to defend the rights of the students to make use of their school library without censorship. The problem with litigation, though, is that you need a plaintiff. You need an individual who's brave enough to stand up in their community and say, I don't want censorship, and I'm willing to sue public officials to get a result. And it's sometimes very hard to do that because in an age where people use social media to attack people, to dox people, where it's easy in a small community to become the target of derision at the grocery store or on the public street, you have to be very brave to do that. And I think of Peter and George and the rest of the librarians at the Library Connection during the Patriot Act era. That's exactly what they did. They found the bravery and the courage to stand up and sue the FBI and the Department of Justice at a time when doing that was enormously unpopular and brought unwanted attention. And so we're lucky to have at least 2 lawsuits going right now. The best remedy is having elected officials who respect the Constitution, who respect our First Amendment rights, who won't engage in the kind of censorship that advances illegal discrimination against marginalized communities. And that falls on us as voters to know who our candidates are, to be involved at local elections and put in place elected officials who are going to care about everyone's civil liberties and not just one group's political agenda. And so, it's kind of a dual solution. But also, if you believe that, you want to be part of a lawsuit and there's censorship going on to your community, the Freedom to Read Foundation is always willing to talk with you. Another lawsuit people may have heard about, which had a very good outcome. There was an effort in Virginia Beach, Virginia, to have 2 books declared obscene for minors to purchase and view. And Virginia actually has a lot of odd old-fashioned statutes on the book. It's one of our, original 13 colonies. There's lots of laws on the books that predate modern legal codes. And this provision allowed any one person to go to a judge and ask them to declare a book obscene without notifying anyone, without requiring that the author or publisher be notified, without requiring the targeted groups like the libraries and booksellers who might distribute the book be notified. And so an individual who's been trying to censor books from the Virginia Beach High School Library, and who also was a candidate for Congress, discovered the statute and filed petitions to have the book's genderqueer and A Court of Mist and Fury, which is a Sarah Maas historical romance novel declared obscene for minors. And in the end, the authors and the publishers filed protests. The school board responded, Barnes and Noble, the bookstore in town, responded. The American Library Association, Virginia Library Association, and the Freedom to Read Foundation joined together to file an amicus petition as well. And the judge in the case fortunately found that there was no grounds to believe that those two books are obscene, either for minors or for adults. They dismissed the case. I think the real effort there was to have the books declared obscene so that they could actually turn around and try to prosecute librarians and booksellers for providing books to minors. It's a disturbing trend that we're observing these days. This language that claims that a book that simply is reflecting the experiences of gay, queer, transgender people are somehow grooming or pedophilia. And we're seeing a real rise in targeted behavior against librarians on social media, even threats and terrible things. And it's just something that should never be tolerated in a democratic society like ours.
So you're talking a little, referred to some of the laws that exist, some of the ones that are still in the books, but what laws are there that support, besides, First Amendment, are there other fundamental laws that help in the defense or in the giving libraries and institutions the ability to provide these materials? And this is based on a question in the chat that says, what fundamental laws are there that define obscenity in literature and nonfiction in classrooms and libraries? And are there laws that entitle libraries to share works that promote things like ADA and Title IX equity and civil rights? So what other kind of legal constructs are there that are working for and against the effort to provide access?
Well, frankly, we do have to look to the First Amendment and the legal precedents decided by the Supreme Court and other courts that interpret constitutional provisions. And much of the legal grounds for protecting the freedom to read do come from court decisions that arise from the original PICO decision in 1982 and subsequent decisions by federal courts since then. And we make sure to try to make that available to boards to use and to incorporate into policies. It's the foundation for the Library Bill of Rights. Now that's a statement of policy and principle from the ALA, but the statements in it are founded both on the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment promise of non-discrimination for government agencies that is there. It's really, we often find that sometimes state constitutions can offer better protections for speech. That's the case in Colorado, in fact. Colorado has a much stronger First Amendment provision in its constitution, and it's enabled us to enact protections for readers in Colorado that we might not achieve under the federal constitution. So that's one thing that could be done, is that the state itself can incorporate protections in its constitutional provisions. They can also look at things like the library code and place requirements on library trustees, board members, to exercise their duties in light of the Constitution and in line with the constitutional principles that should be governing library service. It's difficult to enact legislation that mandates speech, for example, because being free of saying certain things is a liberty as well, First Amendment liberty as well. And we also have to be mindful, we don't want to restrict the right to petition or protest as well, which can also play into this. And we don't want to engage in our own kind of discrimination against, viewpoints or religions either. And so it is a minefield to navigate, but we think that the best practices and policy recommendations we've made do provide a firm ground for library boards to use to protect intellectual freedom. And we're happy to work on state legislation with legislators, resolutions, mandates through the Constitution that declare that the state opposes book censorship and supports the freedom to read. In fact, there are a number of suggestions in the Unite Against Book Bans toolkit that people can find online to use. And always we're happy to work with community groups, community representatives, legislators on those provisions.
So could you give an overview? I think most public libraries do have policies and procedures to deal with challenges to book or reconsideration requests. Could you, from the ALA's perspective, from your policy recommendations, can you give an overview of generally what libraries do and what they have in place to handle and to manage these requests? Because as you say, it's I think from a librarian's perspective, it's not that we're telling people that they can't raise a question or ask a question or bring that up for discussion, but we're looking to have the conversation, right? And to understand what the concerns are so that the librarians and the board can make an informed decision about what the customer or the patron's concern is. So I think most libraries have put policies and procedures in place to handle this responsibly. So it might be helpful for our audience to understand what that looks like. It's pretty prescribed in most institutions.
Actually, we say that there's like 5 policies every library should have. The smallest of libraries, the biggest of libraries. And if you're a smaller library that needs help with putting these together, we're always there to consult at the ALA. But every library should have a collection development policy, a statement of objective principles that govern the acquisition of materials for the library. And that could be pretty detailed. It's as much meant for the staff to use as the public to understand how books are acquired for the library, but it should be in place. The second policy is the reconsideration policy. And this respects the public's right to raise concerns about books being added to the library. And it's a kind of due process thing. We like to say that reconsideration allows the individual with a concern to be fairly heard and have their concern treated seriously and given due consideration, but it also allows for transparency. It allows the community to know that a reconsideration is going on, allows them to add their voice to the conversation, allows the process to draw on the expertise of professional librarians, educators, parents in the community, community representatives in evaluating the book, which is usually done by measuring it against the collection development policy. Was the book acquired according to policy? Does it meet the information needs of some member of the community? That's usually the basic question in any reconsideration of a book. And then provides an opportunity for everyone to be heard and a process to respond to the individual's concern with a decision about the book. And most often, because librarians are so good about their job, the book was acquired to policy. It meets someone's information needs, and it generally should remain on the shelf and does remain on the shelf. Occasionally, a book will be reevaluated and it says, well, this probably should have gone to the young adult collection. Or maybe it's a little more mature, it should be in the adult collection. But we very seldom see the book pulled outright and made unavailable to anyone. And even when books are moved to other parts of the library's collection, they still remain available to any reader of any age that is curious about the book. But we're seeing that circumvented these days. We're seeing both public libraries and school boards ignore written reconsideration policies because they're responding to the political demands and the pressures being put on them right now to censor books bought by these organizations right now.
Right. Well, and we see stories of people going out to literally just check out all the material so they're unavailable, and then force the librarian to making a decision whether to purchase them again or just go without. Or literally there have been instances of actual book burning, which is granted it may have been done for the headlines or for the shock value, but it works, right? When it's 2022 and you hear that there are communities that are literally burning books, it certainly does make you want to run and get your, Ray Bradbury and hold him tight.
Yeah, and probably the most well-known incident is the gentleman about 3 years ago who checked out a number of books that were aged appropriate, developmentally appropriate picture books that simply depicted families headed by same-sex parents, or talked about a child that liked to dress up, and things like that. And he burned them during a Facebook. He filmed himself burning them and broadcasted on Facebook. He did face consequences. He was arrested and convicted of destroying public property. But as you said, he got his headlines. He made his point. The books were replaced. In fact, the library had an overwhelming donation of those titles back.
Yeah.
So often, so sometimes this backfires, but I really, they can come up with all these censorship tools and we'll help libraries deal with them. So now we know with displays on materials that might be the target of censors, maybe we need to put the books on reserve, put a reserve policy in place, or put a short-term loan period on display books or something like that. There are many tools that libraries can use to address the attempt to impose censorship on the community by developing a good policy to address that. So we're hoping that we won't see a repeat of that campaign that we saw this year that targeted Pride Month displays throughout the United States. But it really is, it's just astounding that people can't understand that books are there for voluntary reading and a book on the shelf does no one any harm. And, we like to say every reader has their book, and that's the role of the library, is to match the reader to the book. And in that regard, of course, if a parent has a concern about certain kinds of books, wants to guide their child to certain kinds of books or that reflect their values or something, I know that your staff, librarians across the country, would be happy to work with the parent on that. But their concerns, their values shouldn't dictate what's available to other families in the community, other readers in the community. The library is for everyone and should represent everyone. It's a place where everyone should feel welcomed and included. And, we want to make sure that every librarian, library worker has the tools they need to make that real in their community.
So there's another a question in the chat about policies, and this is from Baker County Library. Don't know where that is, but a library has said, in pursuit of EDI goals, some public libraries are considering updating their collection development policies to include a statement that conveys they will not add materials that cause harm, such as materials that endorse or incite violence or hate against any group. And the question is this feasible without violating the First Amendment?
I really can't say it is feasible, but certainly in looking at what you're collecting for the library, it's fair to consider the impact, the barrier that might be created in the community. But if someone asks for a resource, and I can think of any number of reasons why a book that's controversial may be wanted by a reader. They're doing research on the controversy. They want to develop an argument against the arguments in the book. They want to understand a moment in history. Mein Kampf is probably an example of this. And we shouldn't stand in the way of that kind of use of the material or prevent people from accessing material. And really, we can't always ask those questions. We can only meet the information need. So there may be interlibrary loan involved. There may be acquisition and then subsequent reading if the book no longer circulates. But meeting the information needs of the community has to take priority, especially for a public library. And this, I know that this is a debate that's been going on in the profession for a number of years, but to say absolutely you will not acquire a certain kind of material really boxes us in. It feeds into the narrative that we are not just serving the community's information needs, but we are, there's been many claims that librarians are pursuing a political agenda. We reject that claim, but, we want to make sure that people understand that even if, they have different views, that they can find books that meet their information needs in the library. And, and that's just all part and parcel of the role of the library as being a community hub that provides a wide wealth of information, wide variety of information, so people can read, make up their own minds, make their own decisions on what they believe, and empower themselves to act. And we find often that people want to understand the controversy in some cases, or they're just curious in these things. There's some, and certainly it can be outside collection development. When you've got so little space on the shelf, and you have to make a decision between this book and that book, and this book obviously has greater value for the community, that's the book you should be choosing,
Yeah. And it reminds me too of a similar debate with online resources, that having access to information on the internet incites violence or is a bad thing, and so we need to censor or restrict the kinds of information that people can access on computers, which is again an ongoing conversation and kind of in a similar vein as far as controlling the information that people are able to access. So it hits on multiple fronts. So I think, the observation that librarians and teachers and people that are responsible for making these decisions and providing access to information are really feeling, overwhelmed by this. And there's people that are leaving the profession that are questioning whether or not to go into this, because facing these kinds of challenges, particularly in communities that do seem to be organized around it, are, they worry for their personal safety, because as you said, there's been threats. I know there's been urban libraries reporting on our Urban Libraries Council network that have received threats over these last couple of weeks against them personally. So it's a scary time where it feels like, you don't know what that spark is. It's going to lead to something more serious than a book challenge. So there was a question in the chat too about historically, you noted at the beginning of our discussion that this in your 20-year experience, 22-year experience at ALA, this has certainly been the most challenging time, or has noted the most challenges. Looking back over US history, has there been a similar kind of effort as far as, restricting access to materials that you can think of?
The obvious reach back is to the McCarthy era in the 50s, where we saw the government, State Department itself, burn books in State Department libraries around the world because they were communist or perceived to promote a socialist agenda. And throughout the 50s, there were things like mass burnings of comic books and magazines that didn't meet someone's political standards. And we know that there was a lot of soft censorship or silent censorship of books pulled. I think of the experience of Miss Ruth Brown in Oklahoma. She was a librarian in Oklahoma, and she was perceived as being soft on communism because she did outreach to the African-American community in her town and provided books that met their interest, and she was dismissed as a communist. I could point to any number of examples from the McCarthy era, where academics, librarians all faced enormous challenges. And that's the base, that was the foundation of and the inspiration for the Freedom to Read statement that you can find on the ALA website, was that era. The other obvious reach back is the Nazis burning books that they claimed were too Semitic. And, you know, we all know the tragic outcome of that. I think the lesson to be drawn from all of that is that we have to be vigilant. We have to start defending our liberties and our democratic principles and not give in to this divisive tribal conversation that, you know, has led to these threats against, your colleagues, people who have gone to library school, gone to, school for a teaching degree. All they want to do is share knowledge, to encourage learning, and they're just doing their jobs and they're receiving these threats. The Idaho Library I mentioned earlier, in fact, the library director has resigned because she no longer felt safe in the community. All because she said, we don't have these books that you don't like, but I can't say I'll never collect them. And she essentially has felt so unsafe since, based on the threats she's gotten, that she's had to leave her employment. And you have to think about, where have we gone? Where are we as a society when we tolerate that behavior, when we say nothing about that behavior? And we really have to start standing up to it and standing up for the library workers and the librarians who put so much into serving their communities. I conclude things these days when I talk to people that, they say, oh, you're doing such great work. Well, I'm supporting the librarians in the field. They're the ones in the trenches. They're the people you need to go thank and support and stand up for at board meetings and respond when you see things on social media deriding librarians. We should all be pushing back on this false groomer language that is so derogatory and, as was mentioned to me once, really diminishes the actual threat of child abuse. When we start saying that simply reading a book amounts to that. It's really something, to think about as on our own and try to find ways to empower ourselves to respond and support those who are in libraries and classrooms.
Yeah. So going to the chat too, there are a number of questions. So the first one is from Krista McLeod. She said, do you have any suggestions to help frontline staff who may not have formal training in intellectual freedom issues to talk with the public who may express concerns about materials? And you talked about this a little bit, but do you have any specific guidance or resources to point her to?
Well, some of this is that, I think every library system should have professional development training in place for everyone on staff. We always say that intellectual freedom is a core value and it's the mission of every member of the library staff and even the volunteers, the Friends group. And so, there are a number of experts. I'm not the best, I wouldn't even say I'm not necessarily the best expert on intellectual freedom, but there are a large number of people who do trainings, and we do make recorded trainings available through the Freedom to Read Foundation and other sources that could be good sources for individuals who either want to learn on their own or who want to organize an in-service for staff training day or something like that. And we really encourage this. It's important for everyone to understand what the reconsideration process is and what to say and what to do. We actually see some libraries do skits during staff training days so that people feel empowered and equipped to respond, even if it's just, I'm sorry that you don't like that book and that you're having a bad experience. This is our reconsideration policy and form, and you might want to use it, but let me introduce you to my supervisor or library director, who is probably in a better position to have a conversation with the library worker. And there are a number of excellent print resources. We do publish an intellectual freedom manual every 3 to 4 years that represents the best thinking around intellectual freedom in the profession and also contains all the recommended best practices and policies. The latest edition is just a year old. It was edited by Martin Garner, who is the head librarian at Amherst College, and Trina Maggi, who is at the University of Vermont and very active with the the Vermont Library Association as well. And, you know, there's other books and resources that are available too. If folks are interested in professional development, we're always happy to talk to them and guide them to resources. This could also be a great activity for library, you know, state library groups to pursue as well for their paraprofessionals as well as their professional members.
Absolutely. I know a lot of state libraries are also making that kind of professional development available for people and for libraries and library workers in their state. Okay, so Stephen Roberts asks, do evangelical Christians on the national stage take a stand pro or con book censorship? And that seems a generalization, I'm not sure, but I don't know what your take is on that.
We are seeing a lot of activity from groups that claim Christian identity, the conservative Christian identity, and Christian nationalist identity as well, as the source of many challenges. But often the groups that are bringing this also have a political bent as well. And so I am not, you know, and I know that there have been individual pastors, congregation leaders who have led the charge against books and libraries as well. But I would not say necessarily that it's a denominational thing. In fact, the incident you mentioned where a group called Catholic Vote was said, you know, did that whole campaign, check out all the books that are on Pride displays so no one can see them. And the Chicago Diocese of the Catholic Church issued a very short, brief statement saying Catholic Vote had no association with the church, was not a Catholic group, was a political group, and they had nothing to do with their claims, and they weren't supported by the church. So, you know, I think it's a mixed bag. I think it's inevitable that we have organizations representatives of religious traditions that are arguing for censorship of books based on their moral and religious values, which is truly anti-democratic. We shouldn't, you know, if we defend religious freedom, they're welcome to their beliefs, but their beliefs shouldn't govern everyone else's beliefs or their reading. And that's one of the constitutional fundamentals that I think we need to write these days. I think we've tipped the scales too far when someone's religious beliefs can limit my liberties or your family's liberties.
True. Okay. Paula Carlson asks, has social media made book banning more widespread, which I think you addressed a little earlier, but can certainly revisit that. And how can it be used in favor of librarians and to empower the members of the community that support the freedom to read?
Well, we do know that social media has been a means of organizing for many of these political wedge groups like Moms for Liberty. It's how book lists are traded. There are a number of Facebook groups that criticize literature in libraries and in schools, like Lorna in the libraries, that are run by these adverse groups. And I think being brave enough to mount a response against that is important. Organizing support groups for librarians in your community would be important. I hate to refer it, but this is why we put the toolkit together. But the toolkit on Unite Against Book Bans can have some suggestions as well. But it is a fact that social media has become a powerful driver of censorship right now. It's how the book lists are distributed, how books are misrepresented and vilified and become a thing. I don't think we would have seen half the challenges we saw to the book called Genderqueer, were it not for social media focusing on one panel and misrepresenting the book as being entirely about that topic. We still see complaints that it's a handbook for pedophilia, when in fact, it's a very sensitive literary memoir in graphic novel form of one person's grappling with their gender identity and how they navigated all of that to reach a successful adulthood. And we can't lose sight of the fact that we can't that, social media has so much disinformation and misinformation. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll see someone criticize a book in one community, viral video from a board meeting, and we'll see a raft of challenges following that. And so again, this comes down to individuals stepping up to respond to that, or being aware that that's happening and being at the next board meeting, being in communication with your elected officials so that they know that they shouldn't be endorsing that activity.
Okay, so Vincent Birch asks, what can be done to get library trustees or board members voted out when they oppose the freedom to read? Probably multiple methods, but what are the most common?
Well, I will tell you that this is a method that's targeting board members who are pro-intellectual freedom, but recall elections might be possible under your state laws and local ordinances. So much of this is the arcane details of elections and who can stand for office. And so I can't speak to everything, but know how individuals are either appointed or elected to your boards, and this includes school boards as well as library boards. Know where you can put pressure points on that process. Now, if it's a straight up election, this is where being a responsible voter steps in. Know who's running for office, ask them questions before you vote, know where they stand, and then make sure you show up on election day or engage in your early voting, whatever, to participate in the election, and share that information with your networks, your colleagues, your friends. So much depends. We've seen library board elections swayed by 20 votes because only 1 or 2% of the voters in the community participated in that election. And we got to reverse that trend. There should be as much participation in local elections as there are in presidential elections. There could be provisions for recall. It could be if they're appointed that you talk to your elected officials and make that something that you ask candidates for office, like mayors, city councils, county commissions, who may be in charge of appointing library boards. Make that one of your criterion when you talk to the candidates and who you choose for office. And some of it's just being vocal. Most boards offer opportunities for public comment or receive public comment, at least if they're being open to public. And there are and so, that's another way to bring pressure, and keeping them accountable. Public records requests, making sure that open meetings are being held. That's another way. If there's a board that's acting behind the scenes to remove books without review, without answering to the public, there are means of holding people accountable. I can't think of a single state that doesn't have an open organization that promotes good government and open access to government information. That might not help with that particular process. But the best remedy of all is to either know who you're voting for or frankly stand for office yourself. We need, if you're willing to, meet once a month, be willing to read a budget and expense sheet, and engage with library directors, library staff, you could be a very successful board member. It doesn't take, there's no, just being willing to represent the interests of the community and making sure that you're acting to give them the best library services you can within the budget you have can be the best thing you can do as an individual to defend everyone's ability to read as they wish and choose the books that they want.
So there was an interesting question raised in the chat that says, are libraries who have decided to embrace censorship being supported by ALA?
We try. This is a hard question because we can offer services. We can send letters of concern and support, which we do. But as a 501c3 nonprofit national organization, we can lead by example. We can offer statements, but we can't directly intervene. that's where individuals in the community come in, people who are eligible to vote, the people who are eligible to stand for office, the people who can hold their elected officials accountable are the best response. And an example of that are the 5 citizens in Llano County, Texas, that have agreed to stand up and sue their county commissioners and the library board to try to restore good library service to their county. And, we'll offer strategies and support. Infrequently, we find that the Freedom to Read Foundation can stand as a plaintiff, that we are qualified and to lead litigation, and we will do that. But more often we can act as an amicus curiae, a friend of the court. And there are a number of instances where we scales. We helped a group of students in Arizona, for example, strike down a law that banned the study of ethnic studies in Tucson high schools in Arizona. And it was a long road. That litigation took 7 years, but eventually they won a decision that the state had acted in a discriminatory fashion and had violated both their First Amendment rights and their 14th Amendment rights by banning ethnic studies in their schools. And I'm hopeful that that will be something that can be used in the future by other entities. We know that the ACLU is suing in New Hampshire, Oklahoma, a number of other states to try to overturn these educational gag orders that's limiting young people's education in those states. Again, those lawsuits are at the beginning of the litigation process, but we're hopeful that they'll be able to push that litigation to a successful conclusion. And we've already seen restraining orders issued in some instances on some aspects of those laws.
So Brooklyn Public Library has very publicly made a statement, which I think is, I was proud of my colleagues down there, to make their ebook accessible to anybody. They were really reaching out to, I think, vulnerable teens that may have had some of the materials not unavailable in their libraries to come on. But besides Brooklyn, which the question actually asked New York Public, I don't think New York Public's doing it. I know Brooklyn's doing it. Are you aware of any other libraries that are opening up their content in a way that makes it available to people across the country?
Brooklyn is doing such a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And say that in NYPL's defense, they did it too for a period of time.
Okay.
But as you know, there's licensing involved in things like that.
It's money.
So
Yeah.
we not only should we thank Brooklyn, but the publishers who are making it possible for them to let in a nationwide fashion like this. But I'm not aware of other libraries who've had the governance freedom and the financial freedom to do it, because it takes that, if you know what I mean. Library, I've said this before, but library politics and Brooklyn and NYPL too have a unique freedom. They're in communities that are vastly in support of intellectual freedom, that believe in making access to books available and have the resources available to do that. It would be great if other libraries could step forward to do it or find a way of supporting Brooklyn in their initiative. Frankly, I've been doing other chats for BAM Books Week, and I was in a conversation with folks in Houston, Texas today, and a young man who said he grew up queer in rural Texas said the books he found in the library were life-saving for him. He said, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the public library in my town making these books available. And he said, it's so important for Brooklyn to do what it's doing, because he says it's going to be a lifeline right now with what's happening in Texas, where we're seeing entire shelves of books cleared from school libraries and public libraries in some cases as well.
Yeah. So I also, as I was kind of poking around, looking around in preparation for tonight, I also saw that the Chicago Public Library has started an initiative called the Book Sanctuary, which looks like a really wonderful initiative. And I noticed that, people were signing on to be book sanctuaries. And, I'm sure you've seen that too.
Providing a safe space for BAM Books to make sure that they, and it's kind of speaks to the Fahrenheit 451 thing. Let's make sure that, the recorded literature, history, the works are available and safe. And that's the intent of the book sanctuary is, and it's also an advocacy tool to highlight being censored. And to draw attention, like Banned Books Week, it's an ongoing ban, and it's like an ongoing Banned Books Week in that sense, to highlight what's being censored and to provide an opportunity to contemplate what censorship does to a society, what censorship does to individuals, and what that means for our civil liberties and our freedoms that we enjoy. It's a place it's a comment I make very frequently these days, but we are one of the few societies in the world that promises the freedom to believe as we wish, to read what we want, to speak what we want to say, to practice our religion without interference and all without the interference of the government. That's the promise. And yet we're seeing elected officials step forward to endorse censorship. We're seeing elected boards endorse censorship. And we should all be aghast at the fact that we have individuals who have nominally sworn to uphold the Constitution and the Bill of Rights engaging in this activity and hold them accountable for it. And we should always be mindful about we don't want to lose this. It's the first mark of an authoritarian society, of the loss of liberty, the loss of democracy, when the government starts telling you what you can think, what you can read, and what you believe. And that's what we're seeing happen in so many communities right now.
Well, Deborah, with that, I think that's a perfect place to wrap. We've answered, I think, all the questions that at least that I saw. I want to thank everybody that dialed in today and took part in this conversation. And it's been a great pleasure to spend some time with you and have this discussion, which is so fundamental to, well, the work I do and the work you do. And I think of the foundation of our democracy and our communities. So, and I want to thank Mark Twain House for sponsoring this evening and having me be part of it. So Omar, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Bridget and Deborah. And just on a personal note, having grown up in Hartford, the Hartford Public Library was my safe space. And it was, I wouldn't be the person I am today without it. So very, very honored to have you both here and have all the librarians. My partner's also a librarian, so. So thank you all so much for joining this evening. If you joined us late or want to go back and rewatch the program, you are in luck. All of our virtual programs are posted on our YouTube channel. I'm going to drop a link here and please bookmark it so you can watch it later. Should be up in the next couple days or so, next couple business days. So yeah, and also please check out our events page to see all of our upcoming programs and hopefully join us for another event in the future. We'll be having tons this fall and winter. So please come back. Have a great evening.
Bye, everyone.